Our topic for this evening is prophecy or revelation. Prophecy is the term they usually use in these writings, and in the case that the Rambam is most interested in, of course, that has to do with the revelation of the law. And here we see the fruition of that idea about Maaseh Merkavah. Because Maaseh Merkavah, the account of the chariot, raises the problem about revelation. You might think of that in terms of theophany. How does God appear to a human being? And that's certainly an expression of the problem of Maaseh Merkavah. Here's God who is infinite, who is spiritual rather than physical, who is unique, ineffable, and yet we have sacred writings which purport to represent God, which purport to represent God's will, which purport, in that most extreme case of Ezekiel's vision, even to represent God's appearance. How could God appear? And very pointedly, in terms of the focus of Jewish thought on law, because the Rambam tells you the Torah is not a book of stories, it's not a book of poetry, it's a book of law. It's a book that you're meant to live by, not just for the individual, but for the whole community, not just for one moment in time, but for forever. How does God, who is infinite, express demands and requirements that would regulate our lives in very specific ways? How specific? Well, this specific. So specific that it's overly detailed. That's something that anybody who looks at the Torah has to notice. The cliche about it is that it's a law that regulates every aspect of life. But even that is putting it a little too mildly and a little too weakly, isn't it? Because it regulates aspects of life that weren't even there before the law was written. It tells you about things that you can and cannot eat. It tells you what to do with your time. It tells you all kinds of ritual obligations which are by no means obvious. And these are all taken to be specifications of God's will. So if you get over the problem of how does God appear and how does God speak, there's the further problem of how does God specify and why this set of requirements rather than some other. And it's not at all obvious why that should be the case. Maimonides starts by examining the idea of prophecy itself, and he does so with a view to telling you how prophecy is possible. And that means telling you how we can make sense of the idea of prophecy, or how we can square the idea of prophecy with our knowledge of human psychology and of human nature and of human society and language. That's in keeping with his broad program of trying to reconcile halachic and Jewish and biblical ideas and rabbinic ideas with philosophical and scientific ideas, because the perplexity that he speaks of in his title when he talks about the guide to the perplexed is a perplexity that arises from a kind of cognitive dissonance. Here we've got one set of ideas and another set of ideas, and they seem to jar when they bump up against one another. How is it possible that there should be revelation? How is it possible that certain individuals should be privileged to know what God is and what God wants of us? You have to know that in the time that Maimonides was writing, there were people who thought that wasn't possible. For example, I know they tell you that the Middle Ages was an age of faith, but not everybody in an age of faith has faith. And, the Muslim writers came into contact with Indians. They called them Brahmins, Hindu people. And these Hindu people thought that the strangest thing about Islam was that Muslims believed in prophecy. Why would God single out particular individuals to reveal himself to them? Why to them and not to someone else? that philosopher Razi, that Muslim philosopher who was a very unorthodox sort of a Muslim of the 10th century, died in 925 or 932, two different accounts, whom Maimonides didn't like very much. Razi said that prophets were all imposters, and they pretended to have knowledge that they didn't really have, and they pretended to have privileged and special knowledge, and they only caused a lot of bloodshed and strife. A charge which has been made many times since about revealed religions. And Maimonides wants to make sense of this, and he starts with showing several different stories or theories about what prophecy would be. He says that the unenlightened, and by that he means people who don't belong to a community that accepts the idea of prophecy, think that prophecy could happen to anyone. They think of it in kind of superstitious terms. And he says uneducated people from our own nation tend to think that too, that God sort of miraculously lays it on you like a form of sleep teaching or something like that, that you would get this revelation and you could be an ignoramus and still have these ideas. People who hold that view, he notices, don't go quite all the way into thinking that just anybody, they sort of expect a certain moral probity from a prophet. But they don't expect that it's any kind of a requirement that a prophet would know anything. And I think partly what Maimonides has in mind here is a particular Muslim doctrine, because in Islam, one of the things, Muhammad was called upon to perform miracles, and he didn't, and he said, that the Quran was the miracle, this was the divine revelation, and you could see that these poetic expressions and these laws and so forth in the Quran obviously didn't come from me. I am ummi, he said, which in Arabic means unlettered. And because he said he was unlettered, you know how these things get sort of cranked up and made into a dogma, they developed the idea that Muhammad was illiterate. Probably not exactly true, but that made it even a bigger miracle, right? That this illiterate man would come up with this poetic and seemingly learned exposition of divine revelation. So that Muslim doctrine that Muhammad was illiterate is part, I think, of what Maimonides has in mind when he talks about unenlightened people supposing that even that even somebody who doesn't know anything could be a prophet. Maimonides thinks that's wrong, and I'll tell you when I get to the third theory why he thinks it's wrong. The second theory is the theory of the philosophers, and here he's thinking primarily of Muslim philosophers, Al-Farabi and Avicenna, two Muslim philosophers who preceded him. Al-Farabi died in 950, Avicenna in, I think it's 1037. They had a whole theory of prophecy because they were trying to make sense of the idea of revelation, as he is. And their theory was this, and pay close attention to their theory because he accepts it with one important modification. Maimonides always likes to make one little amendment to those philosophers' theories, but he likes this theory. The theory is this, that we have emanation from God to the human mind. God, after all, is that's the point of connection between human beings and God. We saw that when we were talking about providence and the book of Job and so forth. That's what makes it all worthwhile, is to realize that connection and fulfill that affinity that we have with God. That's what happens to a prophet. Now, the interesting thing about that is that that's actually the same thing that happens in any higher form of knowing at all. Conceptual knowledge, scientific knowledge, it always comes to us from God. Mathematical knowledge comes to us from God. It's all inspiration. all knowledge, except the barest sort of sensory knowledge. But even there, if I start putting a concept on it, I obviously can't get a concept, like the concept of chair, out of the mere appearances, which are just colors and shapes and textures and don't have any concept in them at all. The concept, according to the Neoplatonic way of thinking, must be coming from the divine realm, which means it's coming from God. The chair is an expression of a certain thought of God, and my thought is picking up on that thought, and that's why I can understand the chair or a species of animals or anything else that has a concept to it. I'm getting in touch with God's wisdom. That's the way it works. So what's the difference between prophecy and scientific or philosophical knowledge, which is conceptual? Right? Why is prophecy special? The theory that the philosophers had, he's talking about the Neoplatonic Aristotelians, mainly Muslims of his time, and predecessors. The theory that the philosophers had was that in terms of conceptual content, there isn't really any difference at all between a philosopher's knowledge and a prophet's knowledge. But in terms of the way it's expressed, there's an enormous and very important difference, because the prophet has the skill and the talent and the virtuosity of a poet. The prophet is a person who not only has the concepts, but can verbalize them and visualize them and put them into form. What kind of form? Well, it depends on what kind of prophet. But at the very least, it would be a dream or a vision or a voice. It could go much further than that. It could be a kind of system of law, as you find it with Moses, where you take something which is very abstract and very abstruse, like the pure idea of the good, and you apply it to the situation of humanity, human nature, and your own historical and personal situation, and you come up with a very concrete way of specifying the idea of the good in visionary terms. What's happening is that the conceptual knowledge that a philosopher who was very astute and very insightful might have had of that historical or social or ethical situation has now been realized in words, in images, in institutions, in a word, in symbols. Imagination here is doing the job of mediating between intelligence and concrete particulars and individuals like you and me. So remember what imagination could be responsible. We talked about imagination before. Imagination could be responsible for getting you off track. When you start substituting imaginative constructs for concepts, imagination could get you way off. Imagination could lead you off chasing various objects of appetite and passion. But now, imagination is working in the opposite direction. Imagination is allowing you to do something that a lot of people think is impossible. Namely, to take the ineffable and make it effable. Right? Imagination is translating the infinite into concrete, picturable terms. Now that's terribly important for purposes of communication, because we communicate through symbols. We communicate through words. It's even more important for purposes of community building, because in order to have a community and to live together as a community, it isn't enough to have ideas. Somebody who has a vision but can't express to people what that vision is and what it means for their lives, you know, he can go off and contemplate his navel and live in the woods and persist in his vision. He could be a mystic. He could be a hermit. But he can't give a way of life. He can't even give himself a way of life, really. He's just in the woods because he wants to concentrate. He's not in the woods because he knows that's the way a person should be. He's got to be able to translate that beatific experience, that mystical moment, that Zen point of Satori and Nirvana and all that. He's got to turn that into, shall we say, operational terms, right? What does it mean, as somebody who's very practical might say to this mystic, okay, what does it mean for our lives here and now? And the funny part of it is that the prophet is the person who can answer that question. The prophet is not a mere mystic. The prophet is a philosopher who has that skill with words and that talent with images, who has that special kind of imagination that enables him to translate the meaning of that pure vision into operative terms. That's what all prophets do, according to Maimonides. He's following the philosophers here. He's following Al-Farabi. He's following Avicenna. And he tells you next what the vision of prophecy that the Torah presents is. And as I said, this is the one he's going to sign on to. And there's really only one little difference between this view and the view of the philosophers. And the difference is that he doesn't think that prophecy happens automatically. You could be trained. You could be prepared. You could have the right mental apparatus and the right conceptual insight, and yet not be a prophet. In other words, there's a matter of election here. There's a matter of, if you will, special providence. God has chosen certain people, and the way he puts it, backhandedly, God has chosen certain people to be non-prophets. All right? It doesn't happen automatically. And maybe they're the lucky ones, because prophets have a hard time of it sometimes. But it doesn't happen automatically. And why not? Why not? It's pretty clear, once you understand the psychology that Maimonides is using, why certain people would be prophets and certain people would be not prophets, since the critical factor that differentiates a good philosopher, not just any philosopher, there are like 12,000 philosophers in the United States, most of them would not be candidates. But a really good philosopher who has the right ideas, even he is not likely, or she, because there are, Deborah was a prophet, Miriam was a prophet. Even that philosopher is not likely to be a prophet. Why not? Well, clearly, because they lack imagination. They lack the right kind of imagination. And then he goes back to something that Avicenna proved. Come in and sit down. Avicenna proved that imagination is a physical faculty. How did he prove it? Well, because when you imagine something, you schematize it. My mother-in-law has very good mental imagery of places, remarkably good, at least from my point of view, since I don't have it. And she can visualize. And she can visualize places that she's only been a few times or only once, and she can remember how it is. That's a good example of good imagination. Now, notice what happens there. She's schematizing this. So someplace in her brain, there's a map. It might not be a literal map, but it's going to have parts that correspond bit for bit and place for place with the place that she's envisioning. And this is how Avicenna proves that imagination is a physical faculty. Bear in mind, he doesn't think that conceptual knowledge is a physical faculty. But imagination is. And you know what this means? Here's something where I'm going to step in and supply a piece of information that I think most people don't know. If you go back in the history of Jewish philosophy, one of our great Jewish philosophers was the poet-philosopher Judah Halevi, predecessor of Maimonides, one of the greatest poets in Hebrew since the Psalms. And Halevi, being a poet, his philosophical work is written in the form of a dramatic dialogue, a philosophical dialogue called the Kuzari. We should study it together sometime. And being a poet, he's very sensitive to issues of language and the concrete, and he's very interested in the physical side of Jewish existence in particular, and he feels that the philosophers have put too much emphasis on the intellectual side, which is non-physical. And he wants to bring out what is it genetically about the Jews? And what is it historically? And what is it linguistically? And where does this language come from? Now, what I'm pointing out to you here is that this is a point where Maimonides is actually influenced by Halevi. And the reason I'm telling you this is because if you were taking a course, let's say, at one of our seminaries or one of the programs where these figures are studied, the professor would set up a contrast, and Halevi is the physical guy, and Maimonides is the intellectual guy, and never the twain shall meet. You know, you got to choose between Halevi, which knows about the heart, and Maimonides, which knows about the head. And like any such bad dichotomy, it doesn't work very well. And here's a point where the two actually come together, because Maimonides here is learning something from Halevi. And he's saying, language matters, culture matters. Can we say genes matter? Maimonides thinks so. He doesn't know what genes are, but the physical side of your inheritance. And that actually is what makes the difference. Now, bear in mind that Maimonides identifies divine wisdom with the intellectual, and divine will with the material. And so he says that God, by an act of will, chooses certain individuals not to be prophets. Why? Because they don't have the requisite matter. They don't have the brain stuff that would give them that kind of imagination that would enable them to make the transition between pure ideas and applied ideas, between the concept of the good and the various symbols that might represent it poetically, linguistically, rhetorically, symbolically, ritually, legally, in practices. All right? And if they don't have that mediating imagination, they will be mere philosophers. Right? Okay. If they're any good. Mere good philosophers. All right. Notice the important point in avoiding the superstitious account of prophecy. He says, an ass can't be a prophet. A frog can't be a prophet. And even an immoral person, it's going to turn out, can't be a prophet. You've got to have that prepared ground on which, you know, if you're a painter, you know, before you paint on the paper, you put the gesso, you put stuff on the paper, right? It's got to take the paint. And the prophet's mind, indeed the prophet's brain, needs to be prepared before it can receive that higher form, which is the form of divine inspiration. People can have visions. People can have dreams. And even ignoramuses can do that. But their dreams will not be a reflection of anything profound and important. They'll actually be a projection of things that they've seen during the day, things that they've experienced, rearranged, things that they're working through, as we like to say nowadays in this post-Freudian period. That's what will be in that person's dreams. And you know why when they're dreaming? Well, because you know when you're asleep, you're not getting a lot of input from your senses, and then your mind is working still, and it starts working through things that you hadn't really noticed when you were awake because you were too busy concentrating on everything that you were doing, or being distracted by everything that you were doing. It's a lot like the guy, you know, the old Jewish story about the guy who complained that his house was too crowded with his wife and his children and all that, and the rabbi told him to take in the goat, and the rabbi told him to take in the chickens, and the rabbi told him to take in the cow, and then when he couldn't stand it anymore, the rabbi told him to take those animals out of the house. And the guy came back and he thanked the rabbi. He had never realized how spacious his house was, right? And this is the sort of root of that story, where you've got a lot going on in your head, but you haven't really noticed it. There are unconscious thoughts in your head, and Maimonides, like many medieval thinkers, don't suppose that medieval thinkers didn't know about the unconscious. They do. Like many medieval thinkers, he's very aware that there are all kinds of unconscious processes, and dreaming and visions bring you in touch with those contents of your mind. Dreaming in particular, because you're not being distracted, you know, by sensory data. But it's not necessarily going to lead you any place. To drive home his point, he first of all draws out a corollary, which is about the vision that the people had at Mount Sinai. We've referred to it once or twice already. He says everybody at Mount Sinai had some kind of experience of God, but it was proportioned to their capability. That would be a corollary of his theory. Depending on how well prepared they are and what kind of mind they have, that's the kind of experience of God that they're going to have. That's going to be the limiting factor. After all, the limiting factor is not going to come from God. God is infinite. He finds a proof text from the Talmud, Shabbat 92a, among other citations. Prophecy rests only on the wise, the bold, and the rich. Yes, a little stunning at first. Prophecy rests only on the wise, the bold, and the rich. And let me gloss that for you as Maimonides does. The wise, of course, stands for all the intellectual virtues because of the need for preparedness of the mind. And that's the part of the proof text that he's most interested in at the moment, right? It's not going to rest on a fool. The bold, we've already encountered that idea because remember, he said that there's a certain kind of boldness involved in prophetic license, as I called it, right? Because as the rabbis said elsewhere in the Talmud, great is the boldness of a prophet who would speak of the Creator in the language applicable to the creature. That's that kind of boldness that he thinks is central. Although, as he goes on and expatiates on the idea of prophecy, there's other kinds of boldness or courage or heroism that are relevant too. He remarks with regard to Moses in particular. He said, people vary a lot in their moral capabilities. Some people, he said, are afraid of a mouse. But some people are braver, some people are bolder. And this access of understanding that comes when the mind is really filled with knowledge of God actually heightens one's courage to the point, he says, where you could have a lone individual walking undaunted into the court of a great king with nothing more than his staff and making demands that his people be released from bondage. All right? So he sets up this continuum where you see why courage is necessary. It's not just the poetic courage of the bold image that the prophet uses, likening the Creator to the creature, but the whole moral courage. And we see this in prophecy. The king says to the prophet, "Oh, it's you troublemaker in Israel." Right? And what does the prophet answer him? You know what he says. He says, "I'm not the troublemaker, you are." Imagine a person talking to a king who could conceivably, off with his head. And did. Not in that case, but in others. That's courage. Why rich? That's the one that stops you. But remember what Avot says about rich. Who is wise? He who learns from all men. Who is rich? Hasameach b'chelko. He who rejoices in his portion. The rich person is the one who rejoices in his portion. And their richness stands for the classical Greek virtue of sophrosiny, often translated as temperance. This is the virtue of self-control, self-discipline, modesty, and used here by synecdoche for all of the virtues, right? The moral virtues. Just as wise stands for the intellectual virtues, rich stands for the moral virtues, because a person who knows how to be happy with what he has is obviously a person who has the moral virtues. And a critical one for prophets, right? Because prophets are going to need to overcome the appetites and the sensations that would otherwise distract them and debar them from receiving that vision, which is always there. But which most of us are too distracted to access. Thinking about Sinai, he says, you notice that the Ten Commandments are spoken in the second person singular, thou shalt. And there are lots of different interpretations of that. It's very personal, it's very direct, it's very immediate. But there's another thing about it, too. and that is that, according to Maimonides, all of the Ten Commandments were addressed to Moses and relayed by him to the people. And he has rabbinic interpretation for that, except, I am the Lord thy God, and thou shalt not have any other God before me. Those two they had to hear for themselves. And in that respect, they were doing something like what Moses did, because Moses knew God not by an intermediation of the imagination, but Moses knew God through, remember, the pellucid lens of the mind alone, the intellect, reason, put him in direct contact with God. All right? That's the closest kind of contact that we can have. And in this respect, those two doctrines, those two ideas, I am the Lord thy God, and thou shalt not have any other God before me, the existence of God and the unity of God, or the uniqueness of God, those two doctrines had to be understood by the people directly, and he explains the reason for that is that those are known by reason. The rest require the intervention of imagination to make them concrete. But those two are known direct by reason. And this, if you recall what we were saying about why Maimonides counts those two as commandments, when it seems absurd to ask people, to make a commandment, an obligation out of believing something. How can you make yourself believe something? You can't make yourself believe something. But all the rest of the commandments rest on those, on the existence and the uniqueness of God, right? And what do those rest on? Those rest on the fact that you can know the existence and the uniqueness of God by reason alone. And that's why the people were capable of having that revelation for themselves, and needed to, if they were going to be in a position to accept the commandments. Because they could accept the rest of the commandments as the expression of what God demanded of them. But they'd have to first know that there was a God, and that they had to see for themselves. Very, very interesting explanation there. Notice, please, that one does not rely on the prophet to know that God exists. That would be the worst kind of appeal to authority. That would be bad philosophy, and Maimonides thinks that makes it bad religion. The rest of the mitzvot, he says, are common or public tradition. They are not to be classed as truths of reason, even though they have a lot of rationality and a lot of wisdom to them, especially when you start supplying the specificities and particularities of the human condition. Then you could see, thou shalt not commit adultery. But you'd have to have enough imagination to know what adultery is before that would have application. Prophecy, Maimonides says, demands disinterest. It demands dispassion. It can't be in the service of some ulterior goal or some desire or appetite on the part of the prophet. The prophet, therefore, needs a certain kind of detachment. The prophet can't be a politician in the bad sense of the term. Although the highest form of prophet will be a politician in the good sense of the term, right? He can't be a politician who is trying to play to the crowd and say the things that will please them. But he has to be a politician in the sense of being ultimately a legislator, right? Has to be a leader of some kind. How does the prophet get that kind of disinterest, that kind of detachment? Maimonides says he has to look at all people as either members of the flock who need to be helped and guided and cared for, or as predators who need to be shunned and guarded against. Further corollary, since we know that the passions interfere with prophecy, it's not just passions like sexual passion or anger, which we know interfere with prophecy, and he gives examples of those. But depression, which is a passion, interferes with prophecy too. And that, according to Maimonides, is the reason that prophecy stopped in the diaspora. It's not because prophecy ended as some people say. It's because we, the people of Israel, who have the penchant and who have the potential to receive that kind of revelation and transmit it among ourselves, have lost the nerve, have lost the spirit, have lost the courage, have lost the self-confidence to let it happen. And when the Messiah comes, which as he explains in the Mishneh Torah means when Israel is restored to its land, he doesn't think of this as a supernatural thing. But when Israel is removed from the subjection to the nations, which is the Talmudic definition of the Messianic age, when the Messiah comes, prophecy comes back, because then we will have our self-confidence back. And there will be prophets, and there will be legislation, because we will not be inhibited anymore by this depression, which is a product of, as he puts it, being enslaved by barbarously ignorant people. Now we need to make a distinction, and I've mentioned it before, between inspiration which is personal and inspiration which is public. And we need to make a distinction which we've just been talking about between philosophy, which is conceptual, and prophecy, which takes that conceptual knowledge and translates it into symbols, practical or imaginative symbols. But even philosophers want to share their insights. That's why they publish books, he says. And he's speaking autobiographically there. And prophets have that same burning desire to express and share the knowledge they have. So much so that they risk their lives to do it. They say things that are unwanted and unwanted. And they feel compelled to do that. And you actually have that phenomenology expressed in prophets like Jeremiah and prophets like Amos. Amos says, Lo navi anochi v'lo ben navi. I'm not a prophet, I'm not a son of a prophet, but God took me and God made me say these things. And he says, if a lion roars in the forest, who shall not be afraid? This is the kind of visceral response that the prophet feels and expresses when he's pregnant with this knowledge and he has to give birth to it. And that's the way Maimonides thinks that prophecy works. That's where prophetic boldness really comes from, although it's strengthened by the emanation of understanding. We humans have two characteristics which make us, as Aristotle put it, social animals. Zoon politikon. We, like ants, we live in societies. The two characteristics that make it necessary for humans, if they're to live a fully human life, to live in a society, is our complexity and our differentness from one another, our distinctiveness, our diversity. And those two are in tension with one another. We're very complex, so we have a lot of different sorts of needs. We need different kinds of foods. We need we need entertainment. We need all sorts of things. And at the same time, we're very diverse. We're diverse in character. One man, as he says, is afraid of a mouse, or is afraid when his wife hollers at him. Another one, isn't afraid of anything. There's all this diversity. And the diversity combined with our irascibility makes us a little antisocial. So we need to live together, and it's hard for us to live together. That's the tension, because we're so different from one another. And for that reason, we need leaders, and for that reason, we need laws. And here he makes a distinction between human laws and divine laws. How do you tell the difference between a human law, a law that's authored by human authorities, and a law that comes from God? A human law is notable by the fact that it serves only to regulate human affairs in the way of keeping people from attacking one another, keeping people from defrauding one another, adjusting the market, making sure that people can pursue the blessings of peace and prosperity for themselves and their posterity, that sort of thing. Those are human laws. The things that you see listed in the Constitution, except for happiness, he says, what's generally conceived of as happiness, what people think is happiness. Because, of course, real happiness would be this contact with God. And that's the mark of a divine law. A divine law is a law that tries to get you to learn a way to transcend yourself, to rise above yourself, to become other and more godlike. And it does that in two stages. First, obviously, it has to provide for all those basics in terms of the economy and the regulation of crime and the regulation of civil affairs that any law would have to provide for. As it says in the Torah, you have to have magistrates and you have to have judges in all your precincts. But the first thing that the divine law does beyond that is to try to improve our character. And we've talked about examples of that, like helping your enemy load his ass, which is intended to overcome that irascibility. You can see why that would be such a good example here, because it's irascibility that keeps us from getting along with each other and benefiting from each other as we need to. And then you need laws that would enable you to get in touch with the idea of God and to become more godlike, which is your real purpose in life. And those laws, oddly enough, can't sort of lay it on you. It can't be done by dogma. It can't be done by saying, thou shalt believe in God. There's no such commandment. How is it done? It's done by way of those symbols and institutions which invite you and suggest to you and open up your mind to the possibility of those concepts which will lead you higher and higher towards the conception of an absolutely perfect being and towards the realization of your affinity with that being. A Sabbath is a paradigm case of that kind of law, right? Because the Sabbath is a reminder of the act of creation. We stop work. Strange kind of thing to do. And we think, and we become spiritual, and it becomes a taste of the world to come. And it opens up our mind to a spiritual world, and it opens up our mind to that affinity with God. The Sabbath itself is a very serious law in the Torah. It is a capital offense to violate the Sabbath in the Torah. But the Sabbath is just the symbol. The thing that the Sabbath is supposed to lead to is something that you can only reach by yourself, through your own spiritual and intellectual development. If you look at the law, at the Torah, and when I say look at it, think about the time that Maimonides spent looking at it, and think about the fact that he wasn't just talking about the 613 commandments, which he enumerated in the 2 volumes of the Book of the Commandments, but he's thinking about the whole rabbinic edifice, the whole Talmudic and post-Talmudic structure of the law as we know it, the whole of the halakha. What Maimonides writes as a prefatory remark to his exposition of the law is that all of the laws were given with their explanations. And what that means is that all of the laws make sense. And he quotes the Torah to that effect. He says, you know, ignorant people who were infected with the doctrines of the Kalam think that there are some laws that they call rational laws as if the rest weren't rational. Did God give us irrational laws? Non-rational laws? Laws that don't make any sense? All the laws make sense. All the laws serve purposes. But when you understand a law, and I would point out that this applies as much to secular law as it does to sacred law, when you understand a law, there's one very basic fact that you have to understand, and that is that the particularities which turn the law from a general good idea into an operative rule are underdetermined by the purposes of the law. We have laws that require us to drive safely. That would seem to imply, if you have enough imagination, that you should stay on one side of the road and not the other. But the law doesn't tell you which side of the road, the general principle doesn't tell you which side of the road to stay on. It works if you have a rule that you stay on the right, and it works if you have a rule like they do in England that you stay on the left. It works either way. And the general purpose of the law doesn't tell you which side of the road to stay on, but the law has to, because the law couldn't work as a law unless it's specified. So the law itself is underdetermined by its general principles. And for that reason, Maimonides says that anybody who wants to understand the reasons for the details of the law is on a madman's errand. The reasons for the details of the law are not directly derived from the general purposes of the law. If you want to know what the purposes are of offering sacrifices, he has an account of why we offer sacrifices and why the sacrificial law in the Torah is so detailed. And the account goes something like this. In ancient times, people were pagans. And he knows about pagans in some detail because of a book that he's read called the Nabatean Agriculture, which describes the cult of a group called the Sabians, who were pagan star worshippers. They were polytheists. Still a few of them extant in his time and known to the literature of his time. And he uses the word Sabian as a kind of synonym for pagans. And in those pagan cults, the priests, as he puts it, used to drum it into the people's heads that they had to appease the gods by offering sacrifices. And they thought that their success in agriculture and other worldly affairs depended on, feeding the gods that way. And when Moses came along, he was asking the people to have a really very new way of thinking about God, and a really very new set of laws and obligations and hygiene and all kinds of stuff, and it would have been too much to ask them at the same time to change their mode of worship. And so instead of doing away with the sacrificial cult, which was part of the pagan way of worship, the Torah regulates it, because God accommodated in the same way that a human infant is accommodated by being given milk from the breast when it's too little for solid food. God accommodated to the weakness and incapabilities of the people of that time who thought that worship meant offering sacrifices. And the details of the sacrifices, a lot of them have to do with making it not look like pagan worship, because one of the main purposes of the law is to eliminate pagan worship, and the whole concept that there are multiple gods and warring personalities and human sacrifice and all those things which were part of pagan worship. Elaborate regulations of the sacrificial cult, saying you can only do it in this way, at these times, and indeed in these particular places, restricting that cult. And if you want to know why 7 doves instead of 3 turtles, it has a lot to do with those historical circumstances, which of course are quite extraneous to the general purposes of the law, which is to give you a way of expressing your love and devotion to God. The general principle is very clear. The explanation of the details, perhaps lost in the mists of history. Perhaps it has to do with things that, we've got the details of pagan symbolism and pagan ritual determining the details of our law by making sure that it doesn't look like that. And that's okay. But keep your eye on the main purpose of the law, which is to give you a way of expressing your love and devotion to God. And in fact, our ways of expressing our love and devotion to God grow and change over time, so that we become more interested in prayer, we become more interested in meditation as time goes on. Maybe when the temple is restored, that cult will be restored. Maybe when prophecy is restored, it will be modified. Who knows? We understand it historically. We understand it, as is so characteristic of Maimonides, in an evolutionary sort of fashion, in terms of this was the way of worship, the only way that was accommodated to the way people thought and understood in those days. Every commandment has a purpose. The distinction between the chukim and the mishpatim, the so-called statutes and the so-called ordinances, has to do with whether common people see what the purpose of the law is on the face of it. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not kidnap. We think we know what those are about. Get into the details, however. Not so easy, even with those. Look at the law about kidnapping that we have in this country. If you take a child across the state lines, it becomes a federal offense. If the child has been held for 24 hours, it becomes a federal offense because they might have been taken across state lines. You see how all the details get determined, because you got to determine them, right? You got to have a line to draw. The line becomes very arbitrary. The penalties, the way intention is established. Look at the biblical law about murder and the distinction between murder and manslaughter in biblical law. It's based on intention. But of course intentions are invisible, so you need an overt sign, right? So if these persons had been quarreling before, and if he hit him with a deadly weapon, and there's a definition of what a deadly weapon is, anybody who's a lawyer understands these things. You got to have tests and standards for all these things, right? And the tests and standards will ultimately come down to matters of detail, which are underdetermined by the general purposes of the law, which in this case are that people shouldn't go around killing each other, and that we should make a distinction between people who do it on purpose and people who do it by accident, and people who do it negligently but not intentionally, etc., right? That's the way we do it. That's the way the Torah does it. Maimonides classifies 14 different kinds of biblical law, which are elaborated in the Talmudic code and spelled out in great detail in his own code. And in each case, he shows you what the general purposes of those laws are. Sometimes they're things that are obvious. Sometimes there are things that are not so obvious. The restriction about wearing linen and wool in the same garment, not obvious why we should do that, but the general principle has to do with ways of showing devotion. Some of the laws are designed to limit our appetitive side. Some of them are designed to restrain and limit how sexual we are. But there are limits to those limits. And it's very carefully calibrated. And we get into the distinction between the material and the intellectual and the spiritual. The intellectual representing God's will, and the physical, imaginative, symbolic, representing God's... Did I say it wrong? The intellect, sorry. Yeah, thank you. The intellectual representing God's wisdom and the physical representing God's will. We'll go back and erase that. 18 seconds worth. The law is not just a kind of dead letter. It's a living fabric and structure. It's the realization of a very concrete idea of the good. And if you see a law that has those characteristics in it, that elevates the mind in this way, you know it's a divine law. And if you see it and it has those characteristics and you don't think the purveyor of that law had the spirituality and the disinterest and the sensibility to overcome his own appetites and passions, then you know that his revelation is derivative and not original, but still divine. Let me stop there. Okay. Thank you very much.